My name is Paul Nunes-Dier. I'm a certified professional facilitator from the IAF, which stands for International Association of Facilitators. Since 2018, I've started a book series on architecting collaboration, and my latest book, in co-authorship with Martin Duffy and other renowned digital facilitators and guest co-authors, is titled Beyond Virtual Meetings. It's all about the importance of the digital tools that can extend and augment the power of you as a facilitator and a meeting host in virtual online meetings, but also on the hybrid meetings that are going to be so much needed in this post-pandemic era. Along with my co-author Martin Duffy and esteemed PhD colleague, we host Talk to Your Meeting Doctors, a series of hosted conversations with meeting experts that can advise you about how to transition to this new normal and take advantage of this incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the organization of your meetings more sustainable and effective. Please stand by as the next show will start momentarily.
And we're obviously extremely grateful for your time and your expertise.
Absolutely.
But when you're good at something, Joe, people keep on calling you to come back and have
That's what people keep telling me when they keep calling. So
absolutely. And it's incredible to have Joe Allen here again with us, dear viewers, as Joe is actually the true meeting doctor. Is a professor of industrial and organizational psychology at University of Utah. Of course, a renowned author and running effective meetings for dummies. That's one of his books. And he calls himself meeting doctor for many years before we started this LinkedIn event series, Martin, even though we are here for a couple of years, right?
I think we're novices compared to Joe's range and breadth of expertise, Paul.
Absolutely. But we are live now, so let's get our viewers tuned in and thank them for watching in the multiple recordings we are going to replay throughout the following month, and yet still this month, as this is going to be episode 8 of Talk to Your Meeting Doctors. Yeah. With me, my co-host, Martin.
Afternoon, everybody. Great to be back, Paul.
And as I just presented, Joe Allen, our guest for today. Martin, let's roll the sleeves and kick it off.
Yeah, well, just we were very briefly, just before we came online, Paul, Joe, we were just saying that perhaps our theme or our topic for today is to explore from an organization-wide perspective an overarching question initially, and it might bring us in different directions. Let's see where it goes. But what if an organization had a VP for the organization's meetings? What could the implications of that be for the organization and or for the meetings that take place in an organization?
Well, if you're asking me, it'd be about time.
Good answer.
I mean, it's just, I think it's absolutely absurd that leaders in organizations spend 75% of their time in meetings or on meeting related activities. And we don't ever consider how to hold people accountable and to make sure people know how to do them well. And get whether that be through trainings or performance appraisal processes or any number of other pretty standard operating procedures that we have in organizations. Why don't we have someone who's responsible for organizing that, for structuring that, for creating a way that happens naturally? I don't understand it. I was just telling someone earlier today that I have a list. I literally have a list of all the reasons I've received over the years from people as to why they don't do anything about meetings in their organizations, why there's no training, why there's no accountability, why there's no people that are responsible for ensuring that there's accountability. I ask that question because it's something that I often tell people. Oh, you want your meetings to be better? Why don't you hold people accountable? Why don't you have someone who's doing something around this? And the answers are quite interesting.
Wow. Do share what kind of excuses are people offering?
Well, sometimes it's like, well, it's just meetings. I'm like,
Oh, wow.
yeah, it's just meetings. But sometimes they're more like, well, we don't have the budget for that. And I'm like, well, yeah, that like okay. But you do have the budget for all those meetings that run long or that aren't very effective. And yet you don't have the budget for someone who would make those more effective and maybe cause them to be a little less frequent, you know. Um, the other excuses, include we don't have anybody who could do that, who would be trained in those things. Is there anyone out there who we could hire who knows this stuff, right? Which I think was actually a fairly reasonable excuse. you know Others are like, well, my meetings are fine, it's everybody else that needs help. And so, but it's like, okay, yeah, well, how are you going to help them, right? So it's just an interesting list of excuses that I've received over the years for not necessarily specifically why not hiring a
Sure.
VP,
Yeah.
but not doing something more than just having, Joe or somebody like me come in and say, hey, you could do these better.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, as you went through that list, Joe, I'm just you kind of flashed back in my mind to quite a number of the different episodes that we've had.
Mm,
And those types of comments have come up in different guises in different ways. We
sure.
don't have time, we don't have the expertise. But the overarching point, back to your very first comment, 75% of people's
Hmm.
time in
Yep.
organizations are vested in meetings. That's such a massive resource.
Yep.
And then we're
Yep.
saying, so back to your two follow-on points, we don't have accountability directly, and or what about the expertise to use that 75% of our time more productively, more constructively?
Hmm.
Fascinating way
Yeah.
to think about meetings that almost never comes up in conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and the 75% is really for those who are, mid-level managers and above, so at the lower levels of the organization, you may not have quite as frequent meetings, but once you start getting into management and that sort of thing, you are spending a lot of time in meetings. And it was one of the first things I wrote about meetings was about, quality improvement, viewing meetings as a quality improvement initiative. And that's where some of these numbers around 75% and so forth started to kind of, come about, because it was like, okay, organizations are always looking for ways to improve their effectiveness, always looking for ways to improve quality, always looking for ways to cut costs and improve efficiencies. And it was just, this was 20 years ago, and still to this day, it's maddening that people don't identify this as the way to cut cost, right? To improve efficiencies, right? This is an untapped, very obvious to me. Of course, I'm a meeting doctor, but obvious to me, an area that could be more efficient and increase resources to the organization by eliminating the waste that happens with these inefficient and ineffective meetings.
And say from your either from your academic research, Joe, or from your practical kind of consulting work that you've done,
Yeah.
is there anything that's standing in the way of people adopting the type of changes or the type of attitude or disposition towards meeting improvement? What's in the way? Why would people not go in a direction that you and I are saying that sounds kind of logical?
Well, it's human nature, right?
Yeah,
You can go to basic psychological, principles around culture and behavior, and know that we're all engaging in habits. We've built a habit set and norms around meetings. And so it's whenever we're saying you need to change how you run your meetings, we're saying you need to change how you do what you do.
yeah.
Because if you're spending 75% of your time in meetings, what you do is meeting. And so we're asking, saying, hey, you need to change how you do your job. And you know, people who've been in a job for a while, which is usually what managers and upper level individuals in organizations, they've been in their jobs for a while, maybe not that same organization, but they've been doing this for a while. They've got these habits that are hard to change. every human has habits that are hard to change. Just imagine, just think about dieting. I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry because it's hard to change people's habits when it comes to food. Same thing with meetings. It's really hard to change habits. It's also hard to change organizational culture. And some of the recent work that's been done by myself and and colleagues like Nala Lehman Willenbrock um, look at how meetings are a representation of the culture of an organization. And so we're talking about not just changing someone's habits, but we're talking about changing lots of people's habits and the organization's culture around that activity that we do a lot of. And so anytime we're talking about change, we're talking about change management, we're talking about restructuring of things, we're talking about serious things have to be adjusted in order for you to get a change like that.
Yeah.
And so far, people have been hesitant to do anything that would create that kind of change for their organization.
Yeah. And that's, again, you raise a really interesting point that has come up, and we've actually run entire episodes around the concept of culture and how meetings are so reflective of underlying culture, and that the meetings become confused with that culture. In other words, people think there's something wrong with our meetings, and you say, they're just a symptom. Go to the doctor, and the doctor says, what's the root cause? And the root cause might be something just not quite right with the underlying culture. It's it's a really interesting observation. That so if we were to instigate, for example, a VP for meetings, what might it look like? What might it sound like? What might it do? Who might best be placed to take on the role? There's 100 questions we could start to ask.
Yeah, I mean it's a question, just the question of whether or not you hire a meeting VP or someone to champion that particular issue in your organization is an important decision point, right? Because just the act of hiring someone to do something about it is an intervention when it comes to meetings in general. Just saying, this is important enough that we're going to spend money to hire someone who's going to, their sole focus is to make these more effective and better, right? That's saying something to everybody in the organization that there's a problem and that we intend to fix it.
And what kind of role, just off the top of your head then, Joe, perhaps you've bottomed this one out in more detail. What kind of activities or what kind of role would such a VP actually perform in practice? What would their day-to-day work involve?
Yeah, well, I honestly, from my perspective at the moment, now maybe 10, 15 years from now, this could change. But I would say this person's going to be hosting and doing a lot of trainings. And the reason I say that is because there is not a meeting management class in management schools in the country or in the world, frankly. I mean, there aren't classes like that. I used to teach a class called business communication. This was one of the first classes I taught back almost 20 years ago. And in that class, business communication, you heard the words, right? Business communication. Where does communication happen in business? In meetings. That class, there was literally 3 pages in an entire textbook. I think I may even have a textbook on the shelf here. 3 pages on meetings. And it's about, you should have an agenda and a few tips here and there. That was it. The rest of the entire book was about other forms of communication in organizations. It was, and so I, being a very early on budding meeting scientist, that sort of thing, I spent 3 weeks on meetings for those students. But even so, we don't really, we don't have formal training out there in general that is within our institutes of higher education, where you'd expect basic skills to be taught. We don't teach them how to do meetings, right? And so where does that training happen? Well, it's either on the job, learning from people who are engaging in habits that are, they're okay, but they're not great, right? They're inefficient, but they're not terrible. Or occasionally they'll have someone come in and do a training, once in a while. And I know this because I've done a few of them, and I know others who do as well. And so there's occasionally training. So I think a VP for meetings, one of their first tasks will be developing and implementing a training for everyone who has meetings in the organization. And that, it sounds basic and simple, and maybe something that's beneath what would be considered a typical VP role in some corporations. But I mean, that to me is like because we don't train it anywhere else. Where else are they going to learn it?
That's interesting. There's a concept when I was doing my own research on organization meetings back, it's almost 10 years ago at this stage. But I remember coining the phrase trans participants, because having attended more than 70 meetings in one organization over a year and a half, board level all the way to ops team levels, a pattern evolved, and this wasn't pre-planned. This just happened organically in a medium-sized organization, that there were maybe 3 key people throughout the organization that routinely showed up in the different meetings of different groups with different hats on. But when I analyzed the data that came out of that participation, it became clear that they were a little bit like bees in a flower patch, cross-pollinating. So now they were carrying information, messages, interpretations. That concept, that idea of trans participation, is that something that our VP could do either deliberately as just a meeting participant, or maybe as a meeting chair? In other words, you bring the meeting VP in to chair your meetings. It frees up the boss of the unit to be a participant, observe, listen, take it. Is there merit in that concept, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, a meeting facilitator or a meeting chair, that sort of thing. There are people who specialize in that, who I wouldn't necessarily say that they've received training per se, because again, there's not a whole lot of training. There's training on facilitation, and to some degree that is training in law about negotiation and so forth, right? And so there are people who have those skills, and so a meeting VP would be someone who I would think you'd want to have those kinds of skills. And for certain types of meetings, right, meetings where what you described is ideal, where the meeting leader is not also having to manage the entire meeting flow and conversation. Having someone else do that can free them up to think and to consider and to engage in different ways, right? So it certainly could be something that a meeting VP does, but again, it really depends on what the organization is looking for. Because the other thing that comes to mind for me, for a meeting VP, would be someone who would help work with HR, work with other leaders in the organization to identify ways to hold people accountable for their good and bad behavior in meetings, right? Just like we hold people accountable for their performance in sales performance or reports or any type. We evaluate them every year, fill out forms and all that sort of thing. And yet we don't ever really, that I'm aware of, include anything about their performance in meetings, which people do a lot of, right? And so that's something I think a meeting VP would also need to be involved with, because they'd be hopefully the one who has the expertise to say, okay, here are the things that we should be seeing in meetings, and they could even participate in the evaluation of different teams across the organization. So that person could go to these meetings, not necessarily as a chair, but also could be that. But they could go and be a person who would do observations as part of the accountability process, right? For whether it be coaching of the leaders of those meetings or coaching of the teams on effective meeting behaviors, that sort of thing. But also in terms of accountability from an HR perspective. If somebody is constantly showing up late or monologuing or other things of that nature, these are things that maybe people should be aware of and held accountable for.
Yeah, interesting. When you put it in the context, two contexts that you've mentioned, one much earlier and one almost immediately now. If you put it in the context of quality management, so the management of the quality of people's engagement, participation, contribution. When you think of it from that point of view, alternatively, if you think of it from a business process, even say a production process quality control point of view, so the performance management perspective from an individual side versus the collective quality production management. It's something every organization does it absolutely routinely with all of their business activities, except
Yep.
with their meetings,
Except their meetings.
which is
Yeah, we
really,
just take for granted that these are how that we do them, and they're not going to be great, and that's life.
and we don't see any problem with it because we choose not to do anything
Yeah,
about it.
we
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 just
choose not to. That's, and going down my list, like I said, I have reasons that people have told me, and I have reasons that I've speculated about, and even investigate a little bit, why people don't do anything, why they don't hire a VP of meetings, or why they don't have trainings. Part of it is learned helplessness, right? We've done it this long forever. It's always worked well enough. And so this is how we continue to do it, you know. And yes, there are times when they're truly terrible, and there are times when they're just, pretty good. And so because of that, we just don't identify it as a target for need, for change. And that's the other thing I think a VP, of meetings would need to be very, capable of, would be change management. How would they assist in that process? So everything what you just described, Martin, with those two aspects of it,
yeah,
quality in terms of performance and quality in terms of the process. Well, that's going to require change. And so, what are they going to do, or how do they know change management procedures? Do they have the buy-in from the right people for that change management procedure, and so forth? And so that's, you would engage in that to arrive, hopefully, at the process and the performance expectations that are desired by the organization.
absolutely. Paul,
Absolutely.
you were going to ask something there?
Yeah, I was wondering if I could share with you a case study
Absolutely.
and ear
Sure.
for your comments, both Joe and of course Martin, as I know this will be interesting for both. So this is a case that recently happened with a customer of mine that complained that it didn't add enough time in their meetings, because we started to deal with day-to-day issues, and then we start to think strategically, and then we never had time for either the operational stuff. And as I said to my client, well, start to separate meetings. So if you have strategy thinking meetings like every month, all items that relate to strategy thinking you will address on that particular space, and that will release the rest of the meetings, weekly meetings, for exclusively operational matters. Wow, the client was wow. And this channel separation, and that's the question for you guys, would this be also the reason why tools like Slack are becoming so and so popular in replace as meeting replacers? These team separation, is it really the essence of effective meetings?
I mean, I have thoughts. I think one of the things that I talk about in most of my books, frankly, is the fact that some meetings could be an email. And my point in saying that is not that every meeting should be an email, right? But in saying that there are other forms of communication like Slack and other ways of communicating things, and you can do it in a way that has a theme. Like an email has a subject line. You can actually make it about something, right? Slack has channels, right? And so I think when for some things, more routine things, I would say, those forms of communication are perfectly appropriate. And what I mean by routine is you don't want to have a very complex conversation, or try to have a very complex conversation through email, or through Slack, or through other less rich mediums, because you need, for complex conversations, right, where there's lots of moving parts, lots of issues, or it's a emotionally charged topic or whatever. You need to have the uh, you need to be in person, or you need to be on virtual with video, because you need those additional cues to see what they're to see what's going on, to kind of get a feel for what they're thinking, that sort of thing. But when you're talking about routine things like, oh, what's the status of this project, right?
Mm.
Or when's the report going to be in, or some of those things, a lot of times those get lumped into meetings,
Yeah.
and they're really just very simple questions, or simple conversations that could happen through a Slack channel, or through an email process, or something like that. So I think there's sometimes we could, and those are more efficient too. That's the other thing to remember, that meetings are not very efficient for these really routine things. they're very efficient and very effective, or at least can be, for more complex things. So that's kind of my thought about it. I don't know, Martin, what do you think?
Yeah, well, two things as you presented that case study, Paul. Two things kind of forcefully jumped into my head. One was the concept of requisite variety, which is
Yep.
in systems thinking. It's this idea that a system, the complexity of the system determines how the system can cope with complexity coming into it. So a really simple system generally can only deal with fairly simple things coming in. When you apply that into a meeting setting, we start looking at the makeup of the participants. So if you end up with a meeting that has a very narrow field of participants in it, but if you start lumping in multiple topics on an agenda that need finance, that need HR, that need operations, that need law, that need, all of a sudden we may find that we just have the wrong fit of meeting for the topics that we're trying to get the meeting to think about. So that was the first thing that struck me. That idea of, do we have the right types of meetings to deal with the subject matter we're trying to deal with? And secondly, do we have the right participants in meetings to deal with the agenda items? So the case study shouted that at me. But actually, the second thing, Paul, that came into mind was a good colleague of both of ours at this stage from Lucid Meetings. So Elise, and the work that Elise and her team have done in Lucid Meetings, for me, is fantastically rich with the taxonomy of meetings that they have developed, which for me shouts to the heart of the question that you posed, Paul. And actually, it drags me back to one of your earliest points, Joe, this idea of educating organizations about meetings.
Yep.
So if you took the taxonomy of meetings that Lucid has produced, 16 different meeting types in 3 different meeting, let's call them categories. And if you just took that into any organization boardroom and said to the board, guys, which of these meetings do you think you use? When do you use them? How do you use them? How do you schedule them? And do you think it would be worthwhile actually taking a walk through this taxonomy in your organization? That could be a fascinating exercise to address the deficit, Joe, that you've identified of education about organization meeting. So they're the two thoughts that jumped into my mind, Paul, when you said about your case study.
Amazing. I took my notes. Thank you so much, doctors.
And Martin, when you were talking about the taxonomy of meetings, it made me think of, what is the VP going to do? If like going back to what the original question.
Yeah.
Well, if they walked into their job and said, here's a taxonomy of meetings, how about everybody look at their calendar? And okay, you're in a meeting in an hour. Which one of these is that meeting? Right? Which type of meeting is this? Right? I don't think very often we think about all the meetings we have on our calendar by the different types of meetings that they could be or that they are. Right? I just don't think we think that way necessarily, at least in general. I think we just say, I have a meeting. I have a meeting. I have a meeting. Well, what kind of meeting is it? And based on that, what should you be trying to accomplish in that meeting? And based on that, who should be at that meeting and so forth. And all of these little things to think about. I know people are like, well, that's going to create more time. Well, yes, that'll create more time, but we know that one bad meeting causes 3 more meetings.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's the data is clear. That's what it does.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
so one good meeting probably causes one more good meeting with the same group the next week or the next month or the next year, whatever it is, right? Okay, that's fine. But if you have a bad one, you're going to meet with those same people or a subset of them 3 more times. So I think, taking a moment to think about, okay, what is the nature of the meeting we're about to have and who actually needs to be there and what are we trying to accomplish can ensure that we, over time, we should see a reduction overall in the number of meetings that are caused by previous terrible meetings.
Yeah.
Right.
As you're speaking there, Joe, again, there's a kind of an image that you've created in my mind's eye there. And I'm kind of imagining, let's take an organization with three departments. You know, we've got sales, we've got production, and we've got administration, just off the top of my head. And you say, in those three departments, they run their routine series of meetings of all different types and all different participants. But the interesting thing is, in most organizations, at least the ones I've worked with, the people in sales don't know anything about the production teams meetings. The administration people don't know anything about the sales teams meeting because they're never at them. They don't know that they took place. They don't know what was on the agendas. They don't know what the outcomes were. Back to our VP meetings. If our VP has sight and visibility of all of these schedules of meetings, and if they are deliberately picking meetings and saying, actually, Joe, you're down to have a meeting next Tuesday. Item 3 on your agenda is actually the same as the other group's meeting on the following Thursday. What if we synchronize those? What if we brought you in for his agenda item or vice versa? The possibility for our VP meetings to now act as this bumblebee, moving around the flowers in the garden. If the meetings are flowers in the organization's garden,
Yeah.
do we have the possibility to be the cross-pollinator? Is that something that the VP meetings could actually take on and be usefully beneficial or productive at?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think the challenge there is all the logistical aspects of it that would need to be in place in order for that to occur.
Yeah.
But ultimately, yes, I think, you know, we talked earlier about, you know, what would a VP do first? Well, first they'd have to teach everybody how to you know, schedule meetings and have an agenda, and you know, all the things that we know that people should be doing when it comes to meetings that they're not currently doing.
Yeah.
But let's say that process has taken place. If you've gotten buy-in from everybody that they're going to have their agendas on their calendar invites, and that this VP of meetings has access to all the calendars, all the organizational calendars related to meetings and that sort of thing, and can do that. Yeah, I mean, there's what you're describing is definitely possible, and I think it's reasonable. But I think to get to that point, several other things would have to happen for an organization and for their people to be able to do that. Because I guarantee you right now, I could go on my calendar and I have a bunch of meetings today, tomorrow, and then throughout the week, and I would say less than half, probably closer to 20%, have an agenda attached to them, right? Either an agenda like a document or listed out in the invite. They may, if I'm lucky, have a purpose, right? But they're not going to be as, you know, detailed enough for me to be able to say, if I was looking across meetings for lots of different people or lots of different, you know, groups, or, you know, within an organization, you know, that what the connections are there. You know, that would just be, it'd be impossible at this point in my current organization. Of course, I'm at a university, which is a little different than what you described.
Perfect.
But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, but it's kind of an interesting thought from a let's call it a regular organization. You know, an organization has these multiple departments that we know these meetings are going to happen.
Yes.
In other words, it's predictable, it's mappable, it's codifiable, but we don't actually see these deliberate connections being made where you'd have to guess, well, benefit would have to come from that efficiency wise, information flow wise, and so on. Can I just pause that? Yeah. So
I was just going to say, there's a fascinating development that I've started to see. Every year I read the previous year's literature on meetings, and last year there were 2 articles published on meeting summaries, and using AI and you know, transcriptions to provide a brief 1 to 2 paragraph summary of the meeting, what happened in the meeting, and what the action items were from the meeting. And I'm just taking what you said earlier, Martin, just one step further. Imagine a meeting VP who was able to convince everyone to turn that AI function on. That would create a summary, and those summaries would then be gathered by that person, right? Then they've got that information. They can say, oh, it looks like some decisions were made here that affect this group over here. You know, they could then be made aware of those decisions without even having to have another meeting. They just say, hey, this meeting happened. Here's the summary and the action items. You might want to reach out to the leader there and share your thoughts on that or whatever. I mean, again, that's a kind of a relational aspect of a meeting VP that could happen as we embrace more of these these technologies that are starting to be available. So I just had that thought. I was like, oh, I've seen something recently about that tool, and who knows, maybe that's something that could facilitate what you were describing.
Yeah, because that brought two that brought two ideas as you're describing that, Joe. Two ideas came into my mind there. One is this idea of meeting archives. So in other words, there are two tangible things that most meetings ought to have: agenda and minutes. So there's the input and the output. Typically, the bit missing in the middle is what you've just described. And AI, certainly Paul and myself have had this conversation with a couple of our previous guests over the last year about the power of AI to provide this really condensed, intense summaries. They're not minutes, which are structurally and functionally quite different. But the possibility to build an organization's meeting archive with a view to being a resource, to be searchable, to be referenceable, and now to be a kind of a resource to lean back on to bring forward into future meetings. There's a second concept, which is this idea of cross-meeting communication. Now, I think we touched on it a few minutes ago, but this idea where, two or three different meetings could be talking about parts of the same issue, but they're just not aware that the other meeting is talking about the issue. And the concept of cross-meeting communication, either before the meetings take place, while the meetings are taking place, or after the meetings have taken place. And again, as we consider a VP for meetings, kind of strikes me that that's a theme that a VP for meetings, two themes: archive and active interaction between meetings, before, during, after, could be a really worthy theme that a VP for meetings could pick up and develop as a natural resource for the organization.
But it's interesting, Matt, and sorry to cut you, Joe. That's probably what Slack is trying to accomplish in a way, to provide that structure, meaning that whenever an organization implements Slack, perhaps that organization also needs a meetings VP, right?
Yeah, I can't honestly imagine an organization who doesn't need a meeting VP. But again, I'm a meeting doctor, or I'm the meeting doctor, as I like to describe myself. And so of course I'm going to agree that this is something that is needed. But I think for very, very small organizations, that they just need some training and such. But for organizations that start to have departments and subgroups and so on and so forth, you now have a very you're now getting into a more complex system. And in order for that to run effectively and efficiently, particularly the meetings, you need something like this, right? I mean, if you just took our transcript and said, what are the duties of or what are some possible duties of a meeting VP, you'd have the really good start to a job description. I'm just saying,
I think Paul is going to produce that at the end of our conversation today, Joe.
It's already being done here by Zoom AI Companion. I'm sure Zoom is working diligently to take all the notes from us.
Very nice, very good.
There's a final thought. I'm just mindful of our time, Joe, but there's a final thought which is kind of broad, but I'll call it the politics of participation. And this idea that if you're not invited to a meeting, you can get the hump and you can wonder, why am I not invited? If you are invited to the meeting, oh Christ, not another meeting. Do I? It's and if I go back to my point about requisite variety earlier, having the right people at the right meeting for the right agenda, is there something there that the VP for meetings can be a political czar in the organization?
Yeah, I think the VP for meetings could help with that. But I think the other thing to kind of keep in mind is that people don't do think very hard when it comes to scheduling their meetings and inviting people. They just say, "Oh, I need to include everybody," right?
Yeah.
The default is include everybody, um, or inadvertently not include the right people. you know, that's what tends to happen. And so I think this, if we teach people to think and say, okay, who do I need to have here, and then who would probably like to know what happens here, right? Because that's the difference. Like, okay, what we did to do is say who needs to be here and who would like to know what happens here, and we invite all of those people. Well, that's inefficient. If they need to be here, they need to be here. If they don't need to be here but need to know what happens here, that's where those meeting summaries, the minutes, the other things that come out of the meeting, that's when you share. And then that way they don't get the feeling that they're not included.
Yeah.
They get the feeling that you value their time, or at least if you communicate it the right way, you say, I value your time on your project so much that I'm going to have these 4 people come with me and talk about this issue and make a decision. And then we're going to let you know because we need you to do more with this over here, but we know you want to be aware of this, right? So it's really about reframing how we communicate about inclusion and involving people in meetings and in collaborations. It's not about excluding people. It's about saying, hey, we value your time and your effort so much so that we're going to be smarter about who we invite to meetings and do better about providing summaries and minutes to even those who may not be at the meeting, so that way they can take the 30 seconds to a minute to read that paragraph or two and be as informed as someone who may have gone to the meeting.
Yeah. And that leans back to the point I was just making just a little bit earlier there about, the meeting archives, the
Yes, absolutely.
resource of the output of the meetings, and your point, Joe, to if AI generates, if we allow AI to listen and then to run summaries of content and then disseminate it to people, like you can see such a rich tapestry of where so many efficiencies could be brought about. It's just, maybe it's remarkable. Your opening remark, Joe, I don't understand why people don't have a VP for meetings by any organ. I mean, that was your opening comment to us. And we're probably likely to close with that thought still ringing in our heads. And hopefully our conversation having contributed something to saying, well, here's why it should be done. Here's a bunch of things that it could actually do. And we'd be saying, but why not just go on? Why not do it?
Yeah. Why not do it?
Absolutely.
I don't have a good reason to explain why, but there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, dear viewers, we're approaching the end of our episode. Martin, would you like to sum up your key points or something else?
Sorry, Paul, my feed just froze on me there. I missed your comment or your question there.
No, I was saying we are fast approaching the end of our episode. If you'd like to sum up some key points or something else for a change.
It was one of our, again, unscripted conversations, Joe. You've done 2 of these previously with us. We're obviously grateful for the time and expertise you've contributed to those. Serious questions. We've just raised a whole lot of really serious questions, I think, about the concept of a VP for meetings in an organization. The first task might be education, to enlighten people about meetings. The second task could then start to focus on how meetings are managed within departments, then how they're managed cross-departmentally at the whole organization level, with a view to ensuring that meetings aren't just dots on the landscape in isolation, consuming time, energy, effort, resource for relatively minimal output compared to the input. And certainly there's a very rich array of options, ideas, ways in which meetings could be significantly improved if a VP meetings was actually appointed in any organization. Maybe a theme or a topic. It might be interesting, Paul, to see the AI generated summary of some of the key points coming out of this conversation, because I think we touched on some interesting stuff. Maybe there's a follow-up conversation to come out of it at some point as well.
Oh, definitely. This is something that we have to iterate the effort that we are on a mission here, right, Joe? And but perhaps you
Yeah.
could end up with your final comments on the mission. We that unites us all here in this conversation.
Yeah. I mean, meetings are everywhere, and they're not as good as they could be, and we have the opportunity to make them better. And I think the neatest thing about it is that most of the things that we talk about or that I research and I study are fairly common sense.
Yeah.
They're just not commonly practiced.
So here you are, dear viewers. Thank you so much, dear guest Joe, Alan. Thank you so much, co-host Martin, for your time here today. I hope our viewers have benefited from this conversation as much as I did. Thank you so much, everyone, and looking forward to see you again on our subsequent episodes in September. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Paul.